This is the siege that ended an age. For 55 days, the largest concentration of military force ever assembled around a single world tore itself apart over Terra, and by the end of it, the being who built the Imperium would never walk unaided again. This is the Siege of Terra, reconstructed hour by hour, front by front, from the moment the Void War began to the moment the Golden Throne closed around a body that could no longer be called a man. We need to be honest about what hour by hour means here. Games Workshop has never published a literal 24-hour clock of the siege. What they have published, across nearly a decade of novels culminating in the Siege of Terra series, is a tight internal chronology, a sequence of days, watches, and escalating phases that lets us reconstruct the shape of the battle with real precision, even where the exact clock time is a structuring choice rather than a canon fact. Where this video says hour, it means this is where this event falls in the established sequence, not the codex says 1432. Anywhere the sourcing gets soft, we'll say so out loud. That's the deal. The siege ran across 3 fronts that overlapped in time, but not in geography. Above Terra, in the black, the Solar War decided who would even get a foothold on the planet. On the ground, at the Lion's Gate Spaceport, the largest sustained infantry battle in the history of the setting decided who controlled the last working orbital landing point on the planet. And at the palace walls themselves, the direct assault decided everything else, including whether the being sitting on the not yet golden throne would still be alive to matter by the end of it. Let's start where the siege actually started, not on Terra, above it. Before a single traitor boot touched Himalayan rock, the fight for Terra was a fight for the sky. This part of the story is documented primarily in John French's 2019 novel, The Solar War, the opening volume of the Siege of Terra series, and it's the part most casual fans skip past to get to the ground battle, which is a mistake, because the Void War is where the Loyalists lost their first, and arguably most important, advantage, numbers. Horus Lupercal did not arrive at Sol with a fraction of his strength. After the campaign at Beta Garman stalled, a campaign this channel has covered elsewhere, and one that GW's Age of Darkness material treats as the last real chance to stop the War Master before he reached the heart of the Imperium, Horus committed the overwhelming bulk of his remaining forces to a single objective, not conquest, not territory, Terra itself, and the things sitting inside it. The outer Sol system's defenses were never designed to withstand a force of this scale. Cypra Mundi's shipyards, one of the system's major industrial and defensive nodes, were broken in the opening moves of the campaign. The lunar shipyards, the Throneworld's own orbital construction and repair capacity, were targeted directly because Horus understood something the Loyalist command understood too late. Whoever controlled orbital space controlled the tempo of everything that happened on the ground afterward. This is also where one of the siege's most consequential secrets gets established, and it's worth sitting with because it explains almost every strategic decision the Loyalists make for the rest of the book. The Emperor of Mankind, the singular figure the entire Imperium is built around, was not personally commanding the defense of Terra. He could not. Even before the siege began, the being who had walked among mortals for 10,000 years was bound to a life-sustaining system, a precursor to the Golden Throne the setting later becomes famous for. The Solar War and Saturnine are explicit about this. The Emperor's inability to personally lead was known to an inner circle, Rogel Dawn, Constantin Valdor, Malcador the Sigillite, and deliberately concealed from the wider defense, not out of deception for its own sake. Because an Imperium that believed its God-Emperor could not fight was an Imperium that might already consider itself beaten. That's the psychological weight sitting underneath every void engagement that follows. The defenders of Terra were fighting to protect a figure many of them believed was actively commanding them. He wasn't. He couldn't. And the handful of people who knew that had to keep winning battles while carrying the secret that the man on the recruiting posters was, functionally, already dying. The Void War escalates through a series of engagements that strip away the Throneworld's orbital defense grid piece by piece, void shield generators targeted, defense platforms overwhelmed, Loyalist fleet elements forced into a fighting retreat that buys time rather than victory. Guy Haley's Warhawk, published in 2022, picks up threads of this aerial and orbital combat from a different angle, focusing on the air war that runs in parallel, a reminder that, The Void War wasn't one battle, it was dozens, fought simultaneously across a volume of space that dwarfs anything the setting's ground battles usually depict. The Void War's ending state, by the time French's novel closes, is not loyalist victory. It's loyalist attrition bought at enormous cost, ending with the single image the entire war has been building toward: Horus's flagship, the Vengeful Spirit, breaching into low orbit over Terra, not destroyed, not turned back, present. The War Master's personal command ship, holding position above the Throneworld, meaning the Void War's real outcome was never going to be, the traitors are stopped in space. It was always going to be, the traitors are slowed down just enough that the ground war becomes survivable, instead of instantly fatal. That's the Void War. Weeks of fighting, thousands of vessels, and its entire strategic function was to buy the ground defenders time they didn't know they needed yet. If the Void War decided who got a foothold, the battle for the Lion's Gate spaceport decided how bloody that foothold would be, and it is, by a wide margin, the single largest sustained ground engagement described anywhere in this era of the setting's fiction. Here's why the spaceport mattered so much it justified weeks of continuous fighting over a single facility. By this stage of the siege, most of Terra's other orbital landing capacity had already been destroyed or rendered unusable in the Void War's opening phase. The Lion's Gate spaceport was, functionally, the last door. Whoever held it controlled whether reinforcements, material, and, critically, retreating loyalist forces could move between the ground and anything still functioning in orbit. Losing it didn't just cost the loyalists a location, it would have sealed off the palace from the rest of the fight entirely. Dan Abnett's 2020 novel Saturnine is the primary source for this phase, with Phil Kelly's 2022 novel Mortis filling in adjacent threads. What both books describe is not a clean battle line, it's attrition on a scale the setting rarely commits to prose. Legion strength formations committed and broken, defensive positions traded back and forth across days rather than hours, and a loyalist command structure that has to keep feeding forces into a meat grinder because the alternative is losing the only remaining connection between the ground and the sky. We're going to be careful here about a number that gets repeated a lot in fan summaries: specific casualty figures for the spaceport battle. GW has not published a hard number, and this channel won't invent one. What the source material does establish, in plain qualitative language, is scale: legions effectively broken as fighting forces, defensive lines measured in kilometers rather than city blocks, and a battle that multiple named characters across the novel series describe, in text, as the worst sustained fighting any of them have experienced, which for Space Marines who fought at places like Istvan V is not a small claim. The spaceport fighting runs concurrently with the early stages of the assault on the palace walls themselves, which is part of why reconstructing a clean timeline is genuinely difficult even for GW's own internal continuity. These aren't sequential battles, they're simultaneous fronts drawing from the same shrinking pool of loyalist reserves. Every legion held back to reinforce the spaceport is a legion not available to reinforce the wall. Every reserve committed to the wall is a reserve the spaceport commanders have to do without. That resource tension is the actual engine of tension in this phase of the story, more than any single dramatic confrontation. By the time the spaceport battle resolves, and resolves is generous, large parts of it are still active when the wall assault reaches its climax. Its strategic function has been served. It cost the traitor forces time and strength they needed for the final push on the palace, and it kept the loyalists' last real connection to orbit open just long enough to matter for what happens next. This is the part of the siege most people picture when they hear the words Siege of Terra: the direct assault on the imperial palace itself, the walls, the gates, the Sanctum Imperialis, and ultimately the confrontation that ends the Horus Heresy. The wall assault draws on Aaron Dembski-Bowden's 2021 novel Echoes of Eternity and Chris Wright's 2022 novel Wolf King for its middle sections, and on Dan Abnett's 3-volume finale, The End and the Death, published across 2021 to 2023, for the climax. This is also the section of the siege where the hour-by-hour framing gets genuinely useful, because unlike the Void War or the spaceport battle, the wall assault's final stretch really does compress into something close to a single continuous, escalating sequence, the last hours before the confrontation between Horus and the Emperor. One detail worth flagging honestly before we go further: the exact timing of Leman Russ and the Space Wolves' arrival on Terra is a specific, sourced plot point, not a background detail this channel is inferring. Rates Wolf King is direct about it. Russ and his legion arrive late, after the primary breach of the palace defenses has already begun, which means one of the setting's most powerful individual Space Marine forces spends much of the climactic battle not preventing the breach, but responding to a wall that has already fallen. That's a deliberate authorial choice, and it reframes Russ's entire role in the siege's ending, less the Primarch who saved the day, and more the Primarch who arrived just in time to witness the cost of not arriving sooner. The wall assault escalates through a series of breaches, traitor forces committing everything they have left to punch through the palace's defensive lines, loyalist forces trading ground for time in exactly the same pattern that defined the Spaceport battle, because by this point in the siege, buy time is the only strategic option the defenders have left. There is no reserve large enough to simply stop the assault outright. There is only the question of how much it costs the attackers to get through, and how much of the palace's defenders survive long enough to matter in what comes after the walls fall. What comes after the walls fall is the part of the story most fans know even if they've never read a page of the novels. Sanguinius, Primarch of the Blood Angels, engages Horus in single combat inside the Sanctum, and dies. The End and the Death 3, published in 2023, is the most recent and most detailed telling of this confrontation, and this dossier follows that version as the current authorial word, while flagging, honestly, that earlier era fluff, going back to material like the Horus Heresy core sourcebook and older Index Astartes style summaries, described the same beat in looser, less mechanically specific terms. The load-bearing fact: Sanguinius dies fighting Horus immediately before the Emperor's final intervention, has been consistent across every era of the fluff. The specific texture of how it happens is where the 2023 novel is the more detailed and more current source. Sanguinius's death is what finally brings the Emperor into the fight directly, the being who, for the entire siege up to this point, has been physically unable to lead the defense in person. What follows is described differently in tone across different eras of GW material, and this dossier is not going to pretend that ambiguity doesn't exist. What's consistent, across every version: a direct confrontation between the Emperor and Horus, ending with Horus destroyed, and the Emperor himself catastrophically, permanently reduced badly enough that the only way to keep him alive going forward is the full Golden Throne, not the precursor life support system he'd been bound to for the whole siege. Whether that reduction is described as primarily psychic, the cost of the confrontation itself, or primarily physical, a wound sustained in the fight, differs slightly from telling to telling, and this channel isn't going to manufacture false certainty about a detail GW's own material doesn't nail down identically every time. What matters for the history is the outcome, and the outcome is unambiguous. Horus is gone, and the Emperor who wins the fight is never again the being who could walk among mortals unaided. Before we get to the closing hours, it's worth naming some of the people whose decisions actually shaped this siege, because the popular shorthand for the Siege of Terra collapses almost the entire 55 days into 3 names: Horus, Sanguinius, the Emperor, and that shorthand does real damage to how the battle actually worked. Rogel Dawn, Primarch of the Imperial Fists, is the siege's actual architect. The palace's defensive architecture, the walls, the layered kill zones, the entire logic of trading space for time rather than trying to hold a single unbreakable line, is Dawn's design, and it's a design built by a Primarch whose legion's entire specialty, going back to the Great Crusade, was siege warfare. Saturnine and Echoes of Eternity both spend real time on Dawn, not as a sword-swinging hero, but as a logistics and defense problem solver, operating under the worst possible conditions: an active multi-front siege, a concealed truth about his Emperor's condition, and a defense he knows, mathematically, cannot hold forever. Dawn's psychological arc across the siege novels: a Primarch built for unbreakable defense watching his defense get broken anyway, is one of the more consistently sourced emotional threads across the whole series. Constantin Valdor, Captain General of the Ligau Custodes, and Malcador the Sigilliti, the Emperor's chief advisor, are the other 2 members of the inner circle carrying the concealed truth about the Emperor's condition. Valdor's role across the Solar War and into the later volumes is command of the Custodian Guard in a siege they were never originally built to fight in this configuration. The Custodes' pre-Heresy doctrine assumed they'd never need to defend the palace at this scale, because no one was supposed to be able to reach Terra at all. Malcador's role is closer to political and psychological, managing an Imperium-wide command structure that has to keep functioning while its two most senior surviving authority figures know something the rest of the defense doesn't. On the traitor side, Horus's own inner circle during the siege includes figures like Erebus and Malagurst in advisory and operational roles across different phases of the campaign, and Mortarion's Death Guard, Angron's World Eaters, and elements of multiple other traitor legions committed to different phases of the ground assault. The wall breach was never a single legion's operation. Different novels in the series follow different legion formations at different points in the 55 days, which is part of why no single volume gives you the whole siege. The series structure itself mirrors the siege's actual shape, simultaneous, overlapping, multi-front, told from enough different vantage points that no one character, loyalist or traitor, ever sees the whole thing. Returning to the opening weeks, the Void War's engagements weren't a single running battle so much as a campaign of attrition across dozens of separate flashpoints. The Solar War structures much of its narrative around the Loyalist fleet's attempt to buy time through a series of fighting withdrawals rather than a single decisive stand, a doctrine that makes sense once you understand the Loyalist command already knows, per the concealed truth about the Emperor's condition, that there is no scenario where the Void War alone saves Terra. The goal was never win the Void War. The goal was lose the Void War slowly enough that the ground defense has time to matter. Cypra Mundi's fall matters for a reason beyond the immediate loss of shipyard capacity. It's one of the clearest on-page demonstrations that Horus's forces were willing to spend enormous resources destroying infrastructure that had no direct bearing on taking the palace, purely to strip the Loyalists of any capacity for a longer war. This is consistent with how the Horus Heresy's broader fluff, across GW's Age of Darkness material, characterizes Horus's endgame thinking by this stage of the war, not a campaign aimed at controlled conquest, but one aimed at total, irreversible defeat of the Imperium as a functioning institution, Terra included. Guy Haley's Warhawk adds the air war layer that runs alongside the orbital fighting, atmospheric interceptor engagements and drop assault escort actions that don't get the same attention as the big capital ship clashes but that determined, in practical terms, which traitor ground forces actually made it to the surface intact and which were destroyed in transit. It's a reminder that the Void War, as a single named phase, actually contains several distinct kinds of combat happening at different altitudes and different scales simultaneously, all of it sourced to the same 2019 to 2022 novel window. The Lion's Gate Spaceport battle's defining tactical feature, across both Saturnine and Mortis, is that it was never a battle either side could definitively win through direct assault. Both novels depict a fight that keeps resetting to something close to stalemate, broken only by whichever side is willing to commit fresh reserves that neither side actually has in abundance by this stage of the siege. That's why the fighting stretches across weeks rather than resolving in days. The facility was too strategically important for either side to disengage from, and too heavily defended for either side to take cleanly. Phil Kelly's Mortis, the 2022 entry in the series, follows threads of this fighting from perspectives that include Ladao Custodes elements operating outside their doctrinal comfort zone, and loyalist Imperial Army formations bearing a disproportionate share of the casualties, a detail worth flagging because popular retellings of the siege tend to focus almost entirely on Space Marine combat, when the source material is explicit that mortal Imperial Army regiments made up a huge proportion of the defenders actually holding ground at the spaceport, and paid for it accordingly. This is the section where the hour-by-hour framing earns its keep, because the last stretch before Sanguinius's death really is depicted as a tight, escalating sequence rather than a sprawling multi-week campaign. Wolf King and Echoes of Eternity both track this compression, the sense, on the page, of a defense that has been trading space for time for 50-plus days, suddenly running out of both space and time at once. The wall's final breaches aren't a single dramatic collapse. They're described as a cascading failure, one defensive line falling, forcing a retreat to the next, which buys a little time before it falls too, which was the entire Dawn doctrine playing out exactly as designed, except now there's no line left behind the last one. That's the structural tension the novels build toward, not will the wall hold, because by this point in the siege every reader and every character already knows it won't, but how much time does each collapsing line buy, and is it enough? Leman Russ's arrival, as established, comes after this cascade has already begun. Wolf King's specific contribution to the timeline is showing a Primarch and a legion built around aggressive, fast warfare arriving into a defense that has already shifted from prevent the breach to manage what happens after the breach. Russ doesn't get to fight the battle he came to fight. He gets to fight the battle that's actually happening, which the novel treats as a meaningful character beat rather than a minor scheduling detail. Sanguinius's engagement with Horus inside the sanctum, as covered in The End and the Death, follows directly from this cascade. The Primarch of the Blood Angels isn't intercepting Horus at the outer wall or in open battle, but at the point where the traitor forces have already broken through everything standing between the wall and the Emperor himself. That placement matters for understanding the scene. Sanguinius's stand isn't the first line of defense, it's effectively the last one, which is part of why his death carries the narrative weight it does. There was nothing left behind him except the Emperor. It's worth stopping here to explain why this video keeps insisting on treating the Void War, the Spaceport, and the Wall as three fronts of one continuous problem, rather than three sequential chapters, because that structural choice is the single biggest thing separating an accurate account of the siege from the simplified version most people carry around in their heads. Every loyalist formation committed to the Void War was a formation unavailable to reinforce the Spaceport. Every formation holding the Spaceport was a formation unavailable to reinforce the Wall, and every reserve Dawn held back for the Wall was, by definition, strength not spent trying to win the Spaceport outright, because Dawn's entire doctrine, established across the siege novels as a deliberate, sourced command philosophy, not just this video's interpretation, was that the Wall could not be allowed to fail regardless of what it cost everywhere else. That's a real command decision with real consequences. It's part of why the Spaceport battle grinds into such prolonged attrition instead of resolving cleanly one way or the other. Dawn was never going to release the Wall's reserves to settle it. This is also why the concealment of the Emperor's condition matters strategically and not just emotionally. A command structure that could openly say, "Our God Emperor is currently unable to fight, so every decision about where to commit our dwindling reserves has to be made by mortal and Primarch judgment alone," is a command structure that has to manage morale very differently than one that can point to an active, personally commanding Godhead. Valdor and Malkador's management of that secret isn't a side detail, it's load-bearing infrastructure for every resource allocation decision made across all three fronts for 50+ days. Being straightforward about the state of the canon matters more here than almost anywhere else in the setting, because the Siege of Terra is simultaneously the most written about event in Warhammer 40,000's backstory and one of the least precisely nailed down in terms of hard, GW-confirmed specifics. We don't have a GW-published casualty figure for the siege as a whole, for the Spaceport battle specifically, or for the final wall assault. Every number that circulates in fan spaces claiming otherwise is fan extrapolation, not source material, and this video isn't going to present any of those numbers as fact. We don't have a single, unambiguous, mechanically consistent description of exactly what destroys Horus, and exactly what it costs the Emperor: psychic exhaustion, physical wounding, or some combination the novels intentionally keep somewhat impressionistic rather than clinical. Different eras of GW fluff lean different directions, and The End and the Death, as the most recent and most detailed telling, is this video's primary source for the confrontation's texture. But most recent is not the same claim as the only version that will ever be true, and future GW material could still shift the specifics again, the way it has before. We don't have an official literal hour-by-hour timeline. What we have is a well-documented sequence of phases and relative durations, which is precise enough to build an accurate structural account of the siege, which fronts overlapped with which, who arrived late and why, what order things fell in, without pretending to a level of clock-time precision the source material was never written to provide. The Age of Darkness Codex, published by Games Workshop in 2022, is the source for the siege's overall length, 55 to 56 days, a figure corroborated by the internal chronology running across the novel series rather than stated as a single hard timestamp in any one book. 55 days of the Void War grinding down the Throneworld's orbital defenses, 55 days feeding legions into the meat grinder at the Lion's Gate Spaceport to keep one door to orbit open, 55 days of the palace walls being breached, defended, breached again, until the single confrontation that actually ends the war took place in what was, relative to the length of the siege, a small fraction of its final hours. That's the real shape of this story, and it's worth stating plainly because the popular version, The Emperor Fought Horus and Won, compresses 55 days of institutional sacrifice into a single duel, and in doing so erases almost everyone who made that duel possible to survive until it happened. The loyalist command structure that hid the Emperor's condition to keep the defense from collapsing psychologically, the fleet elements that bled the Void War down to a survivable tempo instead of a rout, the legions broken at the spaceport keeping the last orbital connection open, the wall's defenders trading ground for time against forces that outnumbered them, because time was the only currency the defense of Terra ever had. The siege ends with the ruin storm and the Horus Heresy's broader climax resolving, and with an Imperium that has to reorganize itself around a leader who can no longer lead the way he used to, the beginning of the Council of Terra era, and eventually the Golden Throne as the setting knows it going forward, per Gigawatt's 2022 Age of Darkness material. Whether GW ever publishes a literal hour-by-hour clock of those 55 days is beside the point. The sequence is there, the scale is there, and the cost, measured not in a number this channel is willing to invent, but in the qualitative weight every source agrees on, was the highest the setting has ever asked a single defense to pay. It's worth closing on what actually changed in the setting as a direct, sourced consequence of these 55 days, because the Siege of Terra isn't just a dramatic climax, it's the hinge point the entire 10,000-year status quo of Warhammer 40,000 pivots on. The Golden Throne, as the setting knows it in the 41st millennium, exists because of the wounds sustained in the confrontation with Horus, the precursor life support system that had kept the Emperor alive but unable to lead through the entire siege, was no longer sufficient afterward. The Age of Darkness Codex and the setting's broader 40K-era background material are consistent that the full throne and the Emperor's transition into the silent, immobile figure the far future knows him as, is a direct consequence of what happened in that final confrontation, not a separate, unrelated development. The Council of Terra, the administrative and military structure that effectively governs the Imperium in the Emperor's stead going forward, has its roots in exactly the group of people this video has spent time naming: Dawn, Valdor, Malkador, and the other surviving senior loyalist commanders who carried the Imperium through the siege's worst days. GW's 2022 Age of Darkness material treats the transition from Emperor personally involved in Imperial governance to Imperium governed by a council in the Emperor's name as beginning in the immediate aftermath of the siege, which makes the 55 days covered in this video not just the end of the Horus Heresy, but the literal origin point of the political structure that runs the Imperium for the following 10,000 years, and Rogel Dawn's siege doctrine, trade space for time, hold what can be held, except that some lines will fall so that others can hold longer, doesn't disappear with the end of the fighting. Imperial siege and defense doctrine across the setting's later, 41 stent millennium material consistently echoes the same underlying logic that Dawn applied at Terra, which is about as direct a piece of evidence as the franchise offers that this specific siege, fought over these specific 55 days, reshaped how the Imperium of Man thinks about defending anything, ever again. That's the through line worth taking away from all three fronts of this battle. Not just what happened, hour by hour, across a defense that never had enough of anything except the willingness to keep trading ground for time. What happened afterward, because of it, a throne, a council, and a doctrine of desperate, disciplined defense that the Imperium has never stopped needing since. That's the Siege of Terra, front by front, day by day, for as many hours as the sources actually let us count.